Thanks for joining us, y'all. We're just going to let people roll in here for a minute, but I'm psyched about this one because this is a new take on an old topic. So I'm your host today. I'm Colin Campbell. I'm the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker. And today, you know what you joined, but a quick reminder, we're talking about sales coaching. And we've covered this recently, actually, in a couple other webinars and some content on the Sales Hacker blog where we've talked about like one-to-one sales coaching. What we haven't talked about is how then you scale that. How do you build a sales team, a whole process around effective sales coaching? And to help us talk about that today with some interesting insights, a man who does this for a living is Alex Wise-Hunt, the Sales Effectiveness Manager at Dialpad. Alex, thanks for being here, man.
Thanks for having me, Colin. I'm excited to share some of the things that I've been seeing in the market around sales coaching. I think that this is always one of those really exciting topics. Everyone loves coaching, and I think that one of the challenges a lot of folks have is how do you take that from one-to-one coaching, though, into a broader coaching for a kind of format that goes across the entire program.
Yeah, you and I were just talking before we joined, and I think you put it well when you said, like, if you have 2 reps, coaching's easy, at least like conceptually, very easy to imagine how you would coach 2 reps. When you start to grow a sales team, it becomes a little harder to imagine how you would actually do this. And one of the things that I hear most from sales managers is like, oh, I don't have enough time to do the coaching that I wish I could do. So we're going to get into that in a second. Before we dive in, I just want to say to the people joining, go down right now to the bottom of your screen and click the Q&A button. That's where you can talk to Alex and I. If you don't know already, now you know that Sales Hacker webinars are very interactive and participatory, and we record them all, so you're going to get this recording and you can share it with your friends and colleagues tomorrow when it's in your inbox. But because you're in the live version, you know, act like you're in the live version. I've been so impressed in the past with how interactive the Sales Hacker audience has been. You guys ask great questions. I know you won't let us down today. So yeah, put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll make sure Alex answers as many of them as possible. And actually, I want to start off, if I can, by just getting a sense of like who's in the room. So I have a poll I'm going to launch too in just a few seconds here. You see it, there it is. You see it come up. So I want to know what your role in sales is. We could take this conversation a few different ways. Want to make sure we're giving you our best stories and insights. So take the time, answer the poll. Give you 3 more seconds, and then we'll close it, and we'll take a look at the results together. All right, let's close that poll. Okay, perfect. What do you think of that, Alex?
This is excellent. I'm excited.
All right, so 63% of you are mid-level managers overseeing a team of reps. That's perfect. And also, guys, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure the Q&A thing works. So let us know like your name and your company, throw in your favorite beverage in there so we get the sense that, you know, you guys are going to use that. Cool. Okay, with that, like, Alex, I'll let you take it away. I know you wanted to start with just like a high-level overview, like why are we here? What are we talking about?
Absolutely. So to kind of kick things off today, I thought it would be helpful to go look at some of the trends that we've been seeing in the market with coaching and some of the struggles and challenges that we're having with coaching, especially scaling coaching across organizations, before diving into some of the tips that we've seen to be effective at taking those coaching methods and scaling them across the organization. So jumping in right into kind of some of these market trends that we're seeing, this is one of the areas that we think is always fascinating. We talked a little bit earlier about one-to-one coaching, that a lot of managers feel like they can do one-to-one coaching pretty effectively, especially in small groups. But as soon as we start getting into larger teams or trying to get consistency across multiple teams, this starts becoming really challenging. So taking a look at this is one of the big factors that we've seen adding to kind of the complexity of coaching and scaling coaching. Is that not only are we seeing the rep to manager ratio increasing, but we're also seeing reps that are requesting more coaching, that this is becoming something that's not only manager driven, but rep driven as well. And we see even just in a few years here that the team size is slowly increasing across the board. Some of this is being driven by larger inside sales organizations. Some of this is being driven by organizations trying to be more efficient. But what it's leading to is a challenge. one extra rep on your team may not seem like a lot, but when you're investing several hours of coaching per week into each of your reps, that slowly starts adding up, eating away at your time, and making this a more challenging thing to start tackling across the organization.
And so one of the other things that I think we should look into, since there are so many mid-level managers here, let's take a look. Because can you go back to that slide for 1 second? Yeah, wow. So like 7 reps per manager, I think that's a lot personally. People in the room, there should be another poll that we can queue up for you. Let us know how many reps you manage if you're a manager. And while you guys are answering that, I just want to give a couple shout outs here. So Sydney Faye Williams, thanks for joining. Although it seems like your name is actually Tim. Tim's at double the donation. Allison Gillespie says that says she's none of the above, that she's actually a sales enablement team responsible for training reps. So great webinar for you. Matt Wallace at User Zoom, Steve Hansen at User Zoom. Oh, you guys joined together. That's nice. Did you guys know you were on together? I want to know. Dave Kavan with Incrementa and Nawaz Imam at Usafi. Favorite beverage is sparkling water. That's a good one. I know that like that can get contentious. I like polar beverages personally. Okay, so it seems like actually most people, 45% of you manage between 4 to 7 reps. More than half of you are under 7. But really, it's like almost a 50-50 split. 37% of you manage over 8 reps, and a couple of you are managing more than 12, which is a lot. But this kind of shows that there's a range. It's not just like every single person manages 7, right, on average. So what do you make of that, Alex?
Yeah, this is one of those kind of pieces that we see about how coaching can be so different across different organizations depending on the structure of the different teams. And there's different ways that, depending on the size of your teams, that you need to look at scaling your coaching efforts. It's not always about needing necessarily to scale in the sense of needing to be able to do more coaching per rep, but sometimes it's also about the efficiency and the effectiveness of each individual coaching session. And you're trying to scale those processes. So I think that this is one of the biggest call-outs to me, though, is that we still have almost 40% that are coaching more than 8 reps. And that's a pretty incredible amount of time, especially if you're investing an hour or so per week, per rep. That starts quickly eating up your time. And in an ideal world where you're coaching more than that, that can be really difficult.
I was just going to say, even an hour a week, so a rep's getting 4 hours of coaching a month, that seems light to me. I don't know, what do you see? Like, what's a good amount, Alex, to be coaching per rep?
I think in terms of, there's a difference between formal coaching and informal coaching. And I always like to see at least an hour of formal coaching per week. And typically what I mean by formal is in some way it's documented, it's tracked. There's key takeaways for the rep, key takeaways for the manager. And it's something that they can follow up on the next week and say, did we make improvements on this? Was there progress? But I think that there's a lot of informal coaching that also should be happening per week. It's things like listening into 2 or 3 calls or just snippets of calls and hearing some things that you thought were really good and just passing feedback onto the rep of, hey, good job on these, or here was something that maybe could be improved upon. It's also sharing best practices among the team and team meetings. So by the end of the week, you really are probably shooting for more, closer to 4 to 5 hours of coaching per rep per week. But some of that can have some overlap to the larger team.
Right, like you can maybe coach, and this is where we start talking about scaling some of it. Okay, interesting. And attendees, people in the webinar, let us know like how many hours a week, put it in the chat or the Q&A, you can use whichever, how many hours a week you feel like you're coaching right now. And Alex, feel free to carry on while people answer.
All right. So in addition to having more reps on teams, we're also finding just that there's an increasing complexity in sales in and of itself. Increasing number of buyers, we're having significantly more knowledgeable buyers, and we're also seeing a lot more defined criteria. And when you take these as a mix, it means that your reps are having to understand more than they ever have before. They're needing to actually understand the market and the space or the products that they're selling And they're having to enter a conversation where sometimes a buyer is more knowledgeable than they are on the process that they're trying to solve. And so there's an increasing need to be aware of the messaging that reps have and how they're communicating to prospects or clients on the phone, and making sure that you're able to coach and improve that as time goes on. And when it comes to increasing numbers of buyers and defined criteria, this just kind of adds to that extra level of new pieces that reps need to know. And there's a level of onboarding that training can help deliver some of this, but I think that a lot of this comes just through the reinforcement of coaching, of hearing it again and again in the best way to communicate it and to approach these that really makes a rep effective long term.
Yeah, I think it's a repetition. I mean, I know in marketing we always say somebody needs to hear something like 7, 9, whatever, 12 times to remember it. And they say that when they're talking about like, I'm going to show you my logo. Like you have to get to know who the company is. But it's true for like that's a human thing. If you're going to learn a task, it just takes repetition. Okay, so what do we do about it?
So what do we do about it? This is where we really start getting into the effort of scaling coaching, right? It's how do we have the right conversations, and then how do we build the process in such a way that we can have the right conversation with an exceptionally large group of reps. I've worked with some sales organizations that are dealing with 400 inside sales reps where their big challenge is having this messaging spread out across the board and providing a consistent coaching experience, whereas others are smaller organizations. And it's more about how do you take the best practices from a few really good reps and make sure those are disseminated down to other reps on the team. So as we start going into this, we really start seeing that this idea of coaching and ongoing training has quickly become one of the top challenges that managers are having. It's not necessarily the onboarding process, that initial training, but how do you keep a rep up to date? How do you make sure that they know the latest messaging, that they're following the best practices, and that they're successful, not only on each deal, but also in their career as they move forward?
Yeah, I can just say anecdotally, like I speak to a lot of sales people and sales leaders and everybody in between. And the question that I've seen most often is about like having a time crunch and making sure that reps actually get support that they need in the form of coaching specifically on an ongoing basis. Because it's one thing to bring in like the trainer who does the 3-day workshop or whatever, right? But the ongoing coaching is a whole nother story.
Absolutely. And I think that this is an area that we had some call outs from some sales enablement folks on the phone. And I think that this is a really critical place where sales enablement also has a role to play in coaching, and making sure that training directly leads into coaching and that your managers are as equipped to have conversations around key processes or best practices as you deliver in those initial onboarding trainings.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So let's take a look at some of these challenges now and how do we actually start scaling to make sure that we're able to overcome these. This is always kind of an exciting spot to me because it allows me to go into a little bit of a kind of a pitch of what I think is critical to think about when it comes to any piece of scaling a business or implementing new technology. And that's really that there's 3 steps you got to take. And it's people, process, and technology. And I think that order is also important, that you have to have the right people in place to understand and support and implement a process. And you've got to have a good process in place that talks through what are the best practices for achieving what you want to achieve. And then once you have those in place, you can use the technology to automate and to improve and to increase efficiency. But I think that it's always a little bit of a dangerous path when you jump to technology to solve when you don't have a good process, because automating a bad process is just reiterating that bad process over and over again. So as we start going into this, I think it's important.
You'd rather do less of a bad process than more of it. Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's the same with coaching. Like you want to start from a solid fundamental of 1-to-1, and then when you have that down is when you can scale. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. That's exactly right. Understand what you're trying to coach your reps on. Understand the important aspects that they need support for. And I think that it's important to start from really a relationship with those reps, that when you're talking about scaling coaching, that your reps need to have a lot of belief and trust in the managers that you've got. And I think it's really critical that those frontline managers are really bought into the process and they support the process as you're looking at scaling it.
I love the idea of starting with relationship because that's even more fundamental really than coaching to skills. Like you have to have some kind of, we talk about it all, maybe too much almost, but empathy. You have to have some connection with the person on a personal level before you can go addressing like skill development in a coaching relationship. And you told me a really cool story about this that I'm hoping you can also share with the people in the webinar, because I think this is like the coolest story that I've ever heard about a sales leader or sales manager, like really going the extra mile to make a personal connection with somebody on their team, where other sales managers honestly might have just complained about this person. So can you tell that story?
Sure. So I was working with a VP of sales a few years back, and there was a few reps that consistently went to him for questions, and not the typical, hey, I've got a deal closing at the end, I need executive buy-in type questions, but questions that I've honestly seen some reps be afraid to ask managers. It's like early stage questions where they're afraid someone should think that they should already know the answer, or it's a process that's already been taught and they don't want to make it sound like they weren't paying attention. Questions like that, and they would always go to this VP, and I was always curious why this happened, and so I sat down and chatted with him for a bit, and he talked to me a little bit about how he had initially come into the business several years back as a brand new manager leading a new team of reps. And in particular, he had one rep on his team that was very green, this was his first field role, had never really been out talking face-to-face to clients, and he had recently landed his first big meeting on site. And while he was really excited to start, over time he started getting a little bit of cold feet, started getting a little nervous, and the manager dug in and said, hey, what's going on? And after pushing for a while, he learned that this rep actually didn't have a suit, and that this was making him really nervous. He was afraid of going on site and how he's going to be perceived. He was nervous about kind of his general confidence in talking in front of a client. And so this manager said, you know what? I'm not going to chastise you. I'm not going to be upset. I'm not going to tell you just go buy a suit. And instead, he actually ended up taking extra time off and flew up 3 days early to meet with this rep in person, and actually took him shopping for his first fitted suit. He taught him how to dress. He taught him how to talk. They did a bunch of role playing. They practiced. And he just spent 3 days with the rep, really building his confidence. They didn't talk necessarily about the deal per se. It was all about just building this rep's confidence and understanding of how do you do this in general. And it was a lot of kind of career help. And what it did, though, more than anything, was that rep had an enormous amount of respect for that manager now. And while that manager wasn't able to repeat that process that extreme to every person on his team, that was kind of the approach he took to his team, was it's always about how can I help that rep be successful and improve, and in doing so, building that trust. And in doing that, they come back to him and are able to now ask the hard questions. And he has a better understanding of what happens. He's able to get in front of challenges with deals earlier. He's able to help guide the process. And he can more effectively help remove the roadblocks in front of him. But it all came from that foundation of trust. And it all started with him flying up there and helping this young gentleman buy a suit.
It's such a beautiful, I love that story. Because it's not, you're right, he couldn't do that for every rep every time and, take every rep suit shopping. But the fact that he did it for one rep that really needed it, and the rep who, that they were going to be good. They were in the right role. It's not like they weren't worth the effort. Now the whole team knows that he's willing to go that above and beyond when somebody deserves it.
Yeah, and about 4 years later, every single one of those reps was performing at over 100%. They were still on board.
Still at that company for 4 years.
Still at the 4 years, every single rep on that team.
Wow.
It was the longest tenure of any team, and also the highest average performance of any team.
That's incredible. So we're talking about how to scale coaching. So you tell that story not to say like this is tip number one, but what's the point of that story?
The point of that story is really your people come first. That you've got to have your buy-in from your managers. You got to have the support of your reps, and you got to have that kind of belief that you're doing this to make each of your employees better. And I think that provides a really strong starting point for scaling, because from there you've got the buy-in, you've got the trust, and from there you can really take things further.
Awesome. Okay, got it. So then we've got our fundamentals. Now we're going to get into some tips, right? Like specific tips, like how do you scale what you're doing well? Anybody watching, like this is the time where you might want to, if you have questions about your own situation, you've all answered. Like I see some people here saying like they have 10 reps and they're giving 2 to 3 hours a week per rep. Other people have 4 reps and it's 1 hour a week. You know, so, and they're like everything in between. Some people only get 30 minutes a week per rep. So if you want to ask Alex questions about your situation as we go through some of these tips, pop them in the Q&A. I'm going to try to make sure we save time to talk through anything you want to talk through. All right, so
Perfect.
tip number 1 here.
Tip number 1.
Hold your team accountable.
That's right. I think this is a really critical part of this is understanding that coaching has an impact. And this is a stat that I really love, and it's about businesses that have a formal coaching process in place versus those that don't. And when we talk about a formal coaching process, we're talking about something that if someone had a question of how do you coach, you should be able to give them a document or a site or something that shows here's the steps we follow, here's how often we coach, here's the type of things we coach on. And in doing so, this can have up to a 35% increase in win rates, $75,000 per year increase in deals. This is a huge impact when we're talking about coaching. And the real trick of this is really making sure that it's a process. It's got to be a defined process. And this is really important when scaling as well. And when you have a single manager that's doing coaching really well, you'll typically see the results. You'll know which team is doing coaching well. But it's all about now how do you spread that to the other teams, to the other reps, to ensure that you're being able to recognize this across an entire organization.
So it's not like having the document that makes the coaching more effective. What about having a formal documented process actually makes coaching more effective?
In terms of documenting the coaching sessions themselves?
Well, you said like if somebody asks you how you coach, then you should have something to point to that says like this is how it works. There's a process or a schedule or the types of coaching sessions that we run. What about having that documented actually do you think drives improvement?
I think that there's several parts. One is the consistency that it drives across managers. There are some managers that have been coaching for most of their career, but there's also a lot of managers that have either been promoted up through the sales organization or have come from other roles that aren't always as familiar with best practices when it comes to coaching. So we spend a lot of time looking at the onboarding of our reps. We spend a lot of time looking at rep ramp time. We don't spend as much time looking at manager onboarding though. And I think that's a really critical part of it is how when someone comes into an organization, do you help them understand what the best practices are? And it also helps reps. It helps them get in a cadence of saying, I know I've got a meeting coming up next week and there's certain expectations I have, there's certain expectations that my manager has, and they're able to build their weeks around that and really come prepared and own the process when it's really well documented and they know what to expect. Got it.
Okay, cool. All right, so it's about consistency and really like giving a new manager maybe some support or some direction if they have never done it before.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I also always encourage, VPs to hold regular coaching sessions with their managers. That's something I've implemented at a few organizations really successfully. And I know it always makes managers cringe, but I actually think that it's a great exercise to do. Not necessarily as often as you might coach a rep, but to bring those best practices down across the whole organization.
Absolutely. It's a great idea. I'd love to hear more about that later if we have time to.
Yeah. So real quick, this kind of graph here that's on the screen, one of the things I think that's really key is pulling out some differentiations when we're talking about coaching. Often deal reviews end up being considered coaching. And while deal reviews are really powerful in and of themselves, there's a really important piece about calling out the difference between those. And typically the way I look at that is if you're talking about a deal review, you're often looking at some sort of a sales goal. And so a sales goal requires a buyer or a client to actually say yes to something.
Yep.
Sales coaching, the only person who has to say yes to something is the rep, and they should be able to succeed at doing whatever you're asking them to do without any yes from a buyer. And so I think those are really two critical differentiations between those two when you're looking at your coaching sessions and looking at the importance of both of those.
That's a really important, I think there's like a nuanced distinction there. And I've heard people call it like coaching the deal versus coaching the rep. Or if you're coaching a deal, there's that third party involved who like maybe they throw a wrench in the works, and you can always have a gotcha for the rep. Like if you're the manager and you're looking, oh, I need to find a way to make this rep improve, you can always point to something in any deal, even if the rep executed perfectly, that they could have done better in hindsight. When you're talking about is coaching to the reps' skills and their understanding of the process and their understanding of their customers and your product, right?
That's right.
Right. Okay. Important distinction.
Absolutely.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
We've got
and
actually
got a good
question here, actually. Yeah, from Alex Vispoli. And it's about that coaching process document or some kind of documentation. If you have an example of that, like maybe that's something we can send people after the webinar. I don't know. You and I can talk about it, but it's something that it sounds like people would love to see an example of.
Perfect. I think that's definitely something we could put together.
Cool. Thank you.
So tip number 2, identifying performance zones. I think that the really critical thing that when we're looking at scaling is who are the right people to coach. If you're one of those managers who's got 10 plus people on your team, chances are not every rep needs the same amount of coaching. And the type of coaching that they're getting is probably a little different for each person as well. So identifying performance zones allows you to really quickly start understanding groupings of reps and how you can then be talking to them effectively in your coaching. To do this, I use something that actually came from it was a way of arguing and a way of looking at how do you convince someone to do something. And that evolved over time into a management tool called emotional intelligence, situational leadership, not emotional intelligence, situational leadership, and then became a high-low way of looking at sales coaching. And basically what this said is there's two axes. You've got skill and you've got motivation. And at any given time, your reps are going to sit on this scale in various spots. And this really should help you determine where you're spending the most time coaching. If you have one of your high performers that's been in the role for a long time, they're really excited about the role, they're out there hitting the streets every day or hitting the phones every day, realistically, your coaching for them is more about empowering them. It's about allowing them to take on more responsibility, allow them to come back, bring best practices back to the team, not necessarily going to be providing guidance or direction for them on a daily basis.
Yep.
As you move into your middle ground, this is really where coaching starts to make a difference. These are your folks who in the middle are ideally your core reps. They're well motivated. They're not necessarily super skilled yet, but they want to improve. And then as you kind of get down to this low skill, low motivation, you may have to be directing folks. Or if you get into high skill, low motivation, the reality is sometimes managers need to understand that there's an aspect of coaching that is coaching out of the business, that this may not be the right fit for that rep anymore. Either they're just not motivated in the role, or perhaps this isn't just the career for them. And that there's nothing wrong with coaching them to make better career options in a place that exists not within your business.
Yeah, so this is an awesome grid. And what I would say is like, as a start, just to kind of like start visualizing it, take your team and just mentally, some of you are probably already doing this, place them in one of these squares with no judgment. Like this is about helping them do what's best for them, but put them somewhere and then think about how you can cater, maybe your team meetings, your broader team meetings need to be different. Maybe one-to-ones for some reps look different than one-to-ones for other reps. This gives you some kind of structure to that approach, right?
Absolutely. And I have managers actually do this on a quarterly basis. We typically have some sort of a performance review where we're looking at the reps on the teams anyway, but that's a great time to take a look at, all right, next quarter, what am I focusing on for this particular rep and where do they fit into this matrix? Because in the end, your real goal is to move the middle. Coaching to your top performers is not going to have the impact that you might expect. Coaching to your bottom performers is not going to have a huge impact. Your goal is to move the middle of the group. You want your grid to start slowly moving like this, because this is where most of your reps are going to be. And it's also where, in terms of just pure volume, you're going to be able to drive the best revenue improvement through your coaching.
Yep. Yeah, so somebody else asked a question earlier, I held on to it, about how to coach to the weakest reps. And like, you have to be intentional about it, because if you spend all your time with the weakest reps, that means your majority of your reps and your best reps really aren't getting any of your time. And the truth is, your weakest reps may not improve. They may not, no matter what you do. So they still need some coaching and support. Maybe I've seen bad reps become top performers, so don't like count them out of the game, but just give some critical thought to like how much time you're dedicating to which zones here.
Absolutely. I think that's great insight. So, and that's actually leads really well, I think, into tip number 3, which is crowdsourcing best practices. We're going to take a look here, and this is looking at some of the tech stack that we're using internally, but this could be a variety of different technologies depending on your organization. But the reality is it's taking the best practices of your reps and of your teams and finding a way to bring those in-house and leverage them. It doesn't always have to be your managers that are providing all of the tips and best tricks. Your team is already doing a lot of it, and if you're researching it and really getting into it, you'll actually be surprised at what you can pull out of the different software that you're using. Here internally, we actually had a really great story of one of our BDRs that took one of our outreach sequences, which, if you're not familiar with outreach, is basically a semi-automated sequence of emails and calls that are triggered out by our outreach teams. And he started adjusting some emails and quickly found that his open rates went up by about 15%. And so we went ahead and were able to actually update our core template with some of his suggestions and then roll that out across all the teams. And then do coaching to train them on how then to communicate that during follow-up calls and other pieces like that. So you leverage your teams to pull in tips and tricks that you can leverage in your coaching process. And this also helps scale. Coaching is about improving your teams. This is one of those ways that you can almost, I don't want to say automate it, but pull out the best practices of a large organization very quickly.
Yeah, look for the high performer within each platform and then ask them, what they're doing differently. Maybe they run a training, maybe they update the process, something like that.
Yep, exactly. And you can pull it out either through asking them through questions and their own coaching and have the manager bubble it up or have them lead. Or this is really where having a good sales ops or sales enablement team can also really help. They're in that data a lot of the times, and they can help surface some of those best practices.
Okay, so I was going to ask, because I think, in the past, I led an account management team. Some of you in these webinars have probably heard this story like 1,000 times by now. But for those of you who haven't, I ran an account management team at a marketing agency for several years. And looking back, I remember thinking, I felt as a manager so responsible for training and development and coaching that I felt like all of the coaching content had to come from me. Like I had to be the one. And I finally got over myself and found some of the top performers and outsourced it to them. But still then, honestly, I felt a little bit lazy. So I felt guilty that I wasn't the one driving those training sessions or coaching. So I don't know, was I wrong about that? It sounds like you're saying you can kind of outsource. Oh, there you go. Use
That's exactly what I'm saying. When you start talking about scaling, I don't think you're alone. I think that there's a lot of managers that felt that way and still do feel that way when they're talking about coaching, that it's kind of this singular silo that they're in and they've got to manage all of it. But the reality is they don't. Sales organizations nowadays are becoming so intermingled with different roles, in particular sales ops, enablement, and sales leadership, that these 3 teams are all focused on different aspects of making an organization successful, and each of them can actually provide key ingredients into making a coaching session successful as well, or a larger coaching program a lot of times. For example, when you're talking about coaching, if you're looking at pipeline coaching, one of the things you're looking at is how fast are deals moving through the stages. Well, Sales ops and sales enablement are the teams that have that data and are able to come through and provide that insights into the program that is going to be leveraged in those coaching sessions. Sales managers, though, have to also provide feedback back to these other teams of here's what's working, here's that's not working, here's the challenges. So each group within the sales organization really needs to work together to make this effective, and managers shouldn't go at it alone. This is something that takes a village to really be successful, to scale something. And it doesn't always have to be, if there's smaller organizations that are kind of in the audience, it doesn't always necessarily have to be defined roles. Sometimes I find in smaller sales teams, there's not always a sales enablement expert. And sometimes that's just a manager who's kind of picked up that hat. And that's fine. But having someone in the organization who can kind of help define this as you move through the process really starts helping you scale your processes.
So if I'm like, let's say I'm a VP of sales and I have several sales managers, but then maybe I've got a sales enablement team and a sales ops team, and we've got the village operation going on. I feel like that's great, and it probably makes sure that the training is coming from the right places, but I feel like it could also maybe get a little bit messy in terms of measuring like outcome, making sure messages align. So like how do I, if I have a team like this, who do I hold accountable for sales coaching success? And like, what are the metrics I should be looking at?
Absolutely. When you're looking at sales coaching success, I think that, in the end, the sales managers are owning the number of their core team. Their reports coming in are really going to be driving the performance. But sales enablement and sales ops all have ancillary KPIs that they're looking at to the success of the organization. When we're looking at sales enablement, the real goal there, I always kind of split sales ops and enablement out as ops is trying to make things more efficient, enablement is trying to make things more effective, or a rep more effective. So enablement is often looking at ramp time or looking at the effectiveness of the sales process, or onboarding training, continuing education. Those are KPIs we can start pulling out of time to ramp, and we could be looking at time to first deal close or time to being on target for their goals for the year, or we could be looking at also other KPIs like length of deal cycle or time that it takes to move to first meeting. There's a lot of different KPIs we can start looking at across the board, but all of those are actually being impacted by coaching. And I think that this is where it starts to really come into play that enablement and ops should want to be involved, that they should want to be helping define this process and to empower this process, because what a manager drives to their reps is actually what's starting to impact their KPIs as well.
Do you ever see sales? So this is to a question Dave asked. Dave is with Incremental Consulting, and he part-time leads, I think, 3 sales teams, he said. He has some sales managers under him. He wants to be able to hold his sales managers accountable somehow for coaching success. Do you ever see like people implement like interim KPIs to get a coaching culture kicked off the ground, like a number of coaching hours a week or something even more basic on the activity? Or should Dave really just be looking at like how effective do the sales teams hit their numbers?
I think in an ideal world, we would love to look at just did the sales team hit the number? That's, I think, the easiest way. But I think that we see with reps in the same way that doesn't necessarily work. It also doesn't work with managers. When you're trying to implement a change in a process, you really do have to help guide the culture through that change. And a lot of times that means holding them in some form or fashion accountable. And so I always encourage, when you're building your coaching process out and you're looking at scaling this coaching process, that not only, like we talked about early, are you looking at what should you be coaching on and what are best practices, but also defining the expectations for managers around how many coaching sessions should they have per given time period. Maybe for your organization, it makes sense to do it over a 2-week time span or a month time span. But there should be expectations around the types of meetings that they're holding, the number of meetings that they're holding, and then there should also be some outcomes around how are they showing the impact that that's having. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a direct tie to the revenue numbers or the bookings numbers, But it can be small things like we're seeing an improvement in meeting set, or we had a decrease in the time between stages, or even simply that our tenure of our reps is increasing. I think that that's a really critical piece to consider, is that, reps want coaching, and if they're not being supported in the role, then they're going to leave. And so all of those type of things I think are really key for managers to watch and have ownership of.
I think that's probably my favorite KPI for just like how effective is a manager, especially a sales manager, is do their reps stay? As long as those reps are good reps, like obviously the number has to get hit. But if you put the time and investment into coaching and enabling these people and then they leave, depending on your organization, that's probably a problem. Like some orgs are designed to churn and burn, and it's part of the business model. But for the most part, we want to stay when we invest.
Yeah, for sure.
And that also tells me, like, I could see, unfortunately, probably some of the people in this webinar will go try to do a better job coaching for like a month or 2 months or 3 months. And then, it's not working. It's not worth my time. Maybe there's something else that feels more important and get distracted. But it sounds like kind of under all of this, the point is it's a long-term initiative. Like it's just has to be part of the fabric.
Very long-term.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So once you've got these pieces taken into consideration, I think that really it starts becoming about now how do you leverage technology to help take these processes that you've built and really extend them across the organization. And one of the things that's thankfully very exciting is that technology has come a long way. A few years back, my call coaching process looked similar to this. It was listen to a call, or actually in this case, typically it was I had no idea what call I'm listening to, so it might be listen to 15 calls, find a call that I liked, sit down with a SharePoint form, fill all this out manually, sometimes before I was meeting with the reps, while I had a rep on the line or listening in with me, and then have our coaching session, and then this all was documented. First off, I had to build the SharePoint form, which if any of you like SharePoint, first off, I don't think almost anyone likes SharePoint. But if you do, you have an idea of how complex building anything in the platform is. And this used to be the way coaching was, that if you had technology, you were typically leveraging it very manually in the process. And it took a lot of kind of building certain and special applications of it to get the effectiveness that you were looking for. But as we've come, even just in the last couple of years, we've come a long way in the technology that we can leverage to be effective at coaching. And here's an example of that I love is there's a lot of pieces of technology out there that record calls and transcribe them and provide insights into those calls or key moments, or help you view a single rep or at a large view, a large team of reps, and see how they're doing on calls and what are the best practices and tips that they're kind of surfacing through this. So technology's come a long way. And it's not just in call activity logging or call tracking, but it actually comes in a lot of different kind of formats. And so I want to talk a little bit about the different areas that technology can scale. Because I think that there's so many different pieces of technology out there that it's almost too challenging to try and bucket different technologies into the conversation itself. But instead, it should be a goal of your organization to figure out, like, what am I trying to actually scale? So I think one of the first ones is increasing visibility. And there's so many tools out there that do this really well. That's, hey, I need to know how many calls I'm making. What are the calls that are good or bad? What's being said on those calls? But it also is emails, it's deals, it's pipeline, it's all your different processes that you might be coaching on. How do you have the visibility to even talk about them? So I think that's the first part that you can really look about scaling. And there's a lot of technologies that help do that.
Hey, a quick question on the visibility front.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think a lot of people want visibility into is calls. You're probably the right person to ask this. Nawaz Imam asks, what if you're in a two-party consent state like Washington for call recording and transcribing? Like, how do you go about, getting those calls recorded so that you can coach to them? Yeah,
it's always a challenge, and I think that there's a fear in a lot of sales organizations where culturally in sales we're used to recording calls, we're used to using those in coaching, but more and more there are laws that are out there protecting both sides. And that is potentially scary, because what basically it's saying is that we have to come into a conversation and right off the bat say, hey, this is Alex with Dialpad calling on a recorded line. And there's a lot of fear that that's very offsetting for whoever we're trying to reach. I kind of have two thoughts on that. One, I think that our culture as a whole is changing. And I don't think people are as afraid of being on a recorded line as we like to think they are. But two, I also think that there's a difference in level of fear in the sales organization versus in business leadership and in legal. And I think that there's a larger conversations that sales teams need to have with legal teams around how that is leveraged and what they can and can't do, and understanding what the value of that is. And sometimes they'll get the support from their legal team to invest in software like that, as long as there's the right changes in process to make sure that it's following kind of the letter of the law.
Oh, great input. Yeah, my thought was, try it out. Try it out and just tell people it's a recorded line, and if it starts hurting any results in a big enough way where the lessons you learned from those recordings isn't making up for those losses, then stop doing it.
Yep, absolutely. An organization I worked with a few years back actually did exactly that with a BDR team. They figured that was the highest velocity team and the team that would encounter the most resistance to it. And so they started recording calls with just one of the teams that they had in place, and it found that while it did slightly impact the numbers, it was percentage-wise such a low amount for the extra value and effectiveness that they were getting out of their reps because of the coaching, that while they might lose a percentage or two of calls that are connecting to the right people, in turn, they were able to increase the number of meetings they were setting because of the coaching by 2 or 3%, more than making up for kind of those missed calls.
There's a good lesson right there. So maybe Nawaz doesn't even need to test it. Maybe that org you're describing already tested it. Cool.
So the other is tracking improvement. I think this kind of goes into a lot of the tools that are taking the data and connecting it. And I think with sales tools and technologies, this is a really critical piece, is the ability to integrate with each other, to drive all that data back to a central point and be able to track what it means. So if you're tracking your call coaching, how is that driving pipeline? How is that changing different things? Understanding the different levers you have in an organization that you can adjust to adjust your outcomes is really critical. And that's a key part of scaling, is proving that ROI on the technology. And I think then number 4, reinforce best practices. This is my favorite one because I think it's the part that actually becomes very challenging in larger sales organizations, is how do you get this reinforcement at scale? One-on-ones are great. You're able to talk, but there's a certain level of coaching and support that's almost needed every time you're on a call or every time you're working a deal in Salesforce, that reinforcing these best practices through technology, whether that be through something that can provide real-time assistance on a call, or that is providing pop-ups in Salesforce to guide you through a sales process or to complete a certain task, things that are reinforcing the way you do something on a daily basis, is a very quick way to scale your coaching efforts, because it allows you to take that aspect of coaching out and focus on other critical parts. And then the last part is improving the process. That I think that this is an area we often don't look at, but is a critical part of technology and scaling our coaching processes, is what just makes the process more efficient. It may not necessarily mean that we're giving more insights to our rep, but if it means that it takes them 4 clicks instead of 8 clicks to do something, then we're able to improve that coaching process. A common one that I always reference is logging coaching conversations. A couple of years back, I was using a binder that had notes in it from every coaching conversation with a tab per rep, and was able to flip through it to view my past coaching conversations. Well, now I'm using tools that allow me to log all that online, and I can quickly search back and reference different coaching activities that I've done. And while that doesn't necessarily improve a selling process, it does let me be significantly more efficient with my time, and allows us to have more effective coaching conversations each time we meet. So I think when you're looking at technology to scale, these 5 things are things that you can really easily do with technology. And there's all sorts of different options in the market to help you address each of these.
Very cool.
And so kind of the last real point here that I want to make is that technology and coaching, when you're talking about scaling, especially if you're trying to go after budget to buy technology to do this, is spreading the impact. I think we focus so heavily on tools that just are for coaching that we sometimes forget that there's a lot of other tools and technology out there that are providing enough input and data that we can leverage them for coaching or leverage them to increase the best practices we're uncovering. For example, I think like outreach. Outreach is not what you would consider necessarily a coaching tool, but it allows you to uncover the insights that you need around email and outreach best practices to bring that back to a coaching session and have better conversations with your reps. So when you're looking at technology, think about the broader picture and think about how you're driving large ROI across the business, not only just in the coaching, but in the processes that you're also driving through it.
Another reason why it might be worthwhile to sort of form a like a cross-functional committee of sorts on coaching with sales ops and sales enablement if you have those functions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just real quick, kind of summarizing this up, Colin, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Well, there's a question. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's a good one. Do you mind?
Not at all.
All right, so this is from Andy DeLaura. Good question, Andy. So what do you do with a rep that resists your coaching attempts? Andy says he wants the reps to be invested as he is. Not always the case, which I think is reasonable, but like, do you push it or make coaching optional? How do you approach that?
You know, I think that it's always challenging when you have a rep that resists coaching. And I think the first question you really have to ask after a while is the rep in the right role? And do they really want to be there? But at the same time, I do think you run into challenges, either it be in conflicts of personality or a rep that's tenured enough that they feel like they've got all the right tips already, that you don't necessarily want to coach them out of the business. You want to try and find ways to get them invested. And I've always found that one of the best ways to do that is increasing their involvement in their own coaching. And when you're talking about like a coaching process, one of the things that I'm always a huge fan of is having reps bring things to me that they want to be coached on. So go out and find one call per week. You're bringing it to the session, and you're going to pick 3 things you think that we need to talk about. Doing things like that kind of puts them in control, and especially for reps that feel like they know a little bit of all of it already, takes the manager out of the position sometimes of necessarily having to be the know-it-all, and puts the rep back in charge. And so I always think that that's a really effective way of getting the buy-in from reps.
That's a great exercise. I ran maybe a similar exercise with some of my account managers back in the day where I had them choose role models either from within the business or without, but that were within the functional area that we were in. So like marketing strategy, content marketing, account management, sales, something in that realm. And we broke down like, what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Like, if you want to be like that person, you come up with the plan. Like, you tell me what you think you need to get there. And maybe it's not the vision that I had laid out for you. Maybe I hoped that you would just be an upselling rock star, and it turns out you're just going to be really good at providing great marketing advice to our clients. That's still a better outcome. And like, if that's the only path that I can get you to walk down right now, let's do it. And Andy, a good way to start that conversation is maybe just be honest and say like, hey, Barbara, I feel like I'm underserving you as your manager. There are some things that I want to be able to coach you to that I feel like would give you a benefit and give our business a benefit. But I don't feel like I'm doing that. So like, let's talk about your coaching plan. And I would really love to give you the opportunity to have a little bit more control over your coaching plan. And then you can roll out whatever kind of exercise you want that gives them some buy-in, basically.
Absolutely.
That was a really good question, Andy. Thanks for that. We have a few more minutes, folks. You are awesome and asking amazing questions throughout. Thank you so much. If there are any more, keep them coming. We'll try to squeeze them in. Alex, what are your final points here?
You know, I think that just kind of looking back throughout this, a lot of this comes into people, process, technology. getting the right process in place, understanding what you're trying to accomplish, the types of meetings and best practices you're trying to drive across your teams, getting the right amount of coaching into place by identifying who needs what type of coaching, crowdsourcing those best practices out from your teams, utilizing the support team, sales ops, your sales leadership, your enablement, and sometimes that even goes outside of that. It can be your marketing teams or other teams within the organization. And then leverage technology to extend that reach out across your teams to really allow you to then do it at scale. So I think all of these are just really important tips when looking at scaling sales coaching. If anyone has any questions, I would love to hear them and to chat through with the last couple minutes we've got.
We have another really great question from Serena. Serena, thanks for the question. The question is, how can sales enablement overcome the other barrier, in quotes? Like sales reps see them as as sort of like outside, not really equipped to provide coaching or assessments. Like they're tolerated, they're not valued. I think one of the things I've seen where that happens is when sales enablement becomes like a fulfillment role, where sales teams, sales managers ask for stuff and sales enablement makes the stuff. Serena, you can chime in if you feel like that's your situation or not, and that's the paradigm you're trying to break out of. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And I think that it can also be a challenge when sales enablement teams are first created. I find one of the first kind of topics that they end up getting put in charge of is onboarding. And in doing that, and onboarding is a huge task. To build out a true onboarding program from start to finish takes a lot of work. But what I find is in the end, reps see that as like a graduation. You get to the end of that, and that's sales enablement's role. Beyond that, it sometimes becomes content. That typically I see as kind of the next big area that sales enablement tries to tackle. But overall, I think the really critical thing that enablement teams need to do is look at the overall strategy of how they're engaging with the organization. And sometimes what you'll find is, while content and onboarding is really important, there's sometimes other areas that you can turn and provide value on that will drive a much better relationship with sales. For example, you've got all of this great content. If you're curating all that content, sales loves to know how to best use it. Make sure that you're actually getting out there and working with managers or working with one or two reps that are really doing it well and bringing those reps on to showcase to others how to drive that forward. And don't just tell them. Sales loves stats. So if you can provide the numbers of, hey, we were able to drive these 3 deals or X, $100,000 worth of revenue because we were leveraging these different pieces of content. Those are the type of things that really starts getting sales to listen. And so I always think that looking at the larger kind of strategic view of the organization and how you can make reps effective overall is a really key piece not to lose sight of, even when you're starting to get really bogged down by the onboarding and kind of content.
That's great advice. And Serena does say that she's working on and constantly reinforcing the message that we are a strategic partner to sales. We're not a service organization. It's definitely something you have to repeat. In marketing, I think it's something that we also find ourselves repeating. We're not just like a lead delivery service, right? There's a strategic role for marketing in the organization. Great tip to use stats. I think that's a really powerful one. Cool. Okay, I think that might be all we have time for today. You've been an amazing audience. Thanks everybody for stopping by. I really appreciate you giving me and Alex some of your time today. If you haven't checked out Dialpad, maybe it's time to go check it out. It's a really, really cool organization. Alex is there, so obviously it's amazing. And Alex, thanks so much for giving us some of your time today. Alex Dispoli, yes, this will be recorded for replay. So we'll send the recording tomorrow, share it with everybody. If you want to be like maybe a little passive aggressive, share this with your sales reps and get them thinking about, how you've been trying so hard to coach them and they just aren't listening.
Perfect. Thank you, Colin. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming, everybody. We'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye, everybody.